An obvious choice for Time magazine's Person of the Year. Greta Thunberg captured the world's imagination when a year ago, all alone, she staged those climate action strikes outside the Swedish parliament. This Wednesday, the 16-year-old happened to be in Madrid, where she addressed the COP25 United Nations Climate Conference as it barters over how to finance the planet's energy transition away from carbon.
Without seeing the full picture, we will not solve this crisis. Finding holistic solutions is what the COP should be all about. But instead, it seems to have turned into some kind of opportunity for countries to negotiate loopholes and to avoid raising their ambition.
Meanwhile, over in Strasbourg, the European Union's new executive launching its Green Deal, borrowing the phrase from left-wing U.S. lawmakers who last year called for a Green New Deal over there. The plan to spur big infrastructure spending to make the EU carbon neutral by 2020. It'll require the approval of European leaders, the 28 who meet Thursday in a summit in Brussels. There it'll be a matter of convincing East European states that rely more heavily on fossil fuels. Peter O'Brien has more.
The new European Commission president has launched the EU's Green Deal. She believes it's so ambitious, it could have been launched into space.
This is Europe's man on the moon moment. The European Green Deal is very ambitious, but it will also be very careful in assessing the impact and every single step we're taking.
The idea is to enshrine into law the EU's target to not emit more greenhouse gas than can be absorbed by 2050. It also proposes an increase in emissions cut by 2030 from 40% to up to 55%. Impressive goals, but for some members they're far more difficult to achieve than for others. Poland, for example, generates 80% of its electricity from coal-powered plants. Along with the Czech Republic and Hungary, it hasn't yet signed up to the 2050 carbon neutrality target. To help fossil fuel-dependent nations transition to renewables, the European Commission is proposing a new mechanism, the Just Transition Fund, of at least €35 billion. In total, the programme pledges an investment of €1 trillion over the next decade. A large chunk of the next EU budget would focus on research and development. It also aims to double the European Investment Bank's financing of climate-related work. To try and convince the rest of the world to follow suit, there'll be a carbon border tax, essentially import tariffs on polluting goods. The Commission says the measure would be compatible with World Trade Organization rules.
For more, let's cross to Brussels and correspondent Dave Keating. Dave, you're on the eve of a European Council summit. Right now, its intentions, what have been spelled out by the new European Commission president.
Yeah, this isn't a legislative proposal. This is a strategy. It's outlining what the EU will do for the next 30 years, but more specifically next year, where we're going to see a lot of these really, really ambitious proposals. The big one, of course, is in March to make that 2050 decarbonization target binding under law. And of course, the carbon tax is a very controversial element of this. The idea is it would stop companies from moving outside the EU to avoid this more stringent climate legislation, but businesses are worried it would pose a kind of trade threat, and there are concerns that it wouldn't be compatible with the WTO. And then, of course, there's the Just Transition Fund, which is a lot of money. It's still a little unclear where that's going to come from. That's going to be part of the budget talks that are happening here in Brussels tomorrow. Now, von der Leyen presented this strategy to the European Parliament this afternoon and got kind of a rave response. The Parliament is not her problem. After all, the MEPs are not the ones who have to implement this legislation. That's the national governments, and they're far more skeptical. Already, the headline 2050 goal has been accepted by all EU governments except 3, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. They have been blocking the adoption of that political target for the past 6 months. They're going to try again to convince them tomorrow. I'm being told they probably will end their veto because of that Just Transition Fund. They've been promised money, and for that, they're willing to end their veto. But the bigger reason is that what was made clear in this Green Deal is that the EU is going to go ahead with that binding 2050 target no matter what happens tomorrow. So if Poland still exercises its veto. The Commission's going to go ahead with a legislative proposal for that 2050 target in March. That does not need unanimous approval, and Poland can no longer veto it. So really, it's kind of a put up or shut up moment for Poland tomorrow. They accept this, or they could lose some of that generous promised funding.
Yeah, and Dave, you had the sense when we watched Ursula von der Leyen speaking in Strasbourg that this was it. We're really now into the thick of it. The Jean-Claude Juncker years are over.
Yeah, I mean, this is her big first policy initiative. And so a lot of eyes were on her to see, can she really pull this off, this type of really ambitious climate legislation? I think people so far have been very impressed with her speaking style. It is certainly more clear than Jean-Claude Juncker. And she's very good at dipping in and out of different languages. She's very multilingual. So she is already viewed as kind of a better presenter of EU policy than Jean-Claude Juncker ever was. The question is, does she have the stamina, the rigor to really push through these reforms in the face of so much resistance that will be seen from the business community and from those Eastern European governments? She's going to come here to the European Council tomorrow, and she's going to outline this Green New Deal and try to see if she can convince those skeptical countries to end their veto. That's really the test here, because it's very easy, of course, to make a speech in front of a friendly audience like the European Parliament, as she did today. It's a much harder thing to be behind the scenes here in this building at the European Council, facing skeptical prime ministers and still be able to convince them to take these difficult actions. That's going to be the test, and we're going to see over the coming year whether she can strong-arm skeptical governments into agreeing this ambitious climate strategy.
Hey, at least coincidence of the calendar, she was in tune with the news cycle, what with Time naming Greta Thunberg as its Person of the Year.
Yeah, what was quite interesting is she seemed to borrow a lot of Thunberg's language when she gave her press conference and address to the parliament today. She said the EU needs to pursue a new kind of economic growth, an economic growth that doesn't take but gives. It was really mirroring the language that Thunberg has been using, especially in that clip of her speech at the UN Climate Summit in September, where she talked about a fantasy of unending economic growth. Von der Leyen really borrowed that language today in the press conference and talking about how the existing model of growth that the EU has pursued is not sustainable, it no longer works, and it needs to be changed. So I think you can really see Thunberg's influence on policy in this Green Deal that's been unveiled today. Without her, I'm not sure it could have been so ambitious.
Many thanks for that. Dave Keating reporting live, and who will be covering that European Council summit Thursday and Friday from Brussels.